You get nothing, Mason. Charles Holloway's voice cut through the mahogany-paneled dining room of his Cape Cod estate where 32 Holloway family members had gathered for their traditional Thanksgiving dinner. The elderly patriarch sat in his wheelchair like a king on a crumbling throne. His lawyer Harold Banks standing beside him with a leather portfolio clutched tightly against his chest. Mason Holloway felt 31 pairs of eyes shift toward him, the weight of their judgment pressed against his skin like November frost on the windows. Outside, the Atlantic churned beneath a gunmetal sky, waves crashing against the private shoreline that had belonged to the Holloways for 5 generations. What Charles didn't know was that the medical equipment keeping him alive, the heart monitor beeping softly beside his wheelchair, the round-the-clock nurses, the experimental immunotherapy treatments that had given him 3 more years, Mason had paid for all of it. Every treatment, every specialist, every moment of borrowed time. The announcement had come 2 weeks earlier. Family meeting Thanksgiving at 4 p.m., attendance mandatory. Charles Holloway had always been dramatic, but this felt different, ominous. Mason's mother Elizabeth had called him 3 times asking what he'd done to upset grandfather. Nothing, Mason had said honestly. I haven't done anything. But that was the problem, wasn't it, in his family's eyes? Mason had done nothing worthy. No prestigious corporate career, no political ambitions, no wife, no children, just his little charity work that he never discussed at family gatherings. Now, sitting at the massive oak table surrounded by cousins in business suits and designer dresses, Mason understood. This was his public execution. Mason has wasted his life, Charles continued, gesturing with a trembling hand. He's 31 years old with no career, no prospects, no ambition. While his cousins built successful lives, he's been playing at charity work for a decade. Mason's cousin Bradley smirked from across the table. As a hedge fund manager, he'd explained cryptocurrency to Mason at Christmas like he was 5 years old. Next to him, cousin Veronica, newly made partner at her corporate law firm, nodded approvingly. Mason noticed his cousin Spencer watching from the corner, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Spencer had been investigating him for months, hoping to find something to use against him. I've watched each of you build something meaningful, Charles said, looking around the room. Bradley manages billions in investments. Veronica just made partner. David runs 3 medical practices. All of you have made the Holloway name proud. He turned back to Mason, his gaze cold. Mason works at some LGBT shelter, making poverty wages, living in a tiny apartment, driving a 15-year-old car. He's thrown away every advantage this family gave him. The room fell silent except for the soft beep of Charles's heart monitor, the same monitor Mason had installed last year when his grandfather's cardiologist recommended round-the-clock observation. As Charles announced his estate plans would exclude Mason, Mason glanced at the portrait of his grandmother hanging above the fireplace. She had been the only one who supported him when he came out at 19. Before she passed, she had whispered, "Don't let bitterness poison your heart. Mason, promise me." "Grandfather," Mason said softly, standing up, "I understand." "Do you?" Charles's eyes narrowed. "Do you understand what a disappointment you've been? Your family built an empire from nothing. We gave you every opportunity, the best schools, the right connections, seed money for any business venture, and you chose to waste it all. Someone has to help people," Mason replied quietly. "Let other people help people." Charles snapped. "You were supposed to build something, create wealth, continue the Holloway legacy. Instead, you're serving soup to homeless queers." Spencer chuckled audibly. Mason took a deep breath, walked to his grandfather, and gently kissed him on the cheek. "I love you, grandfather," he said simply. As Mason returned to his seat, his phone vibrated. A text from his assistant. "Board meeting in an hour. The hospital expansion proposal needs approval. Also, Mr. Holloway's care coordinator asking about Q1 payment, $184, $700 for medical expenses. Standard authorization." Mason typed back quickly, Approve the expansion. Yes to Q1 payment. We'll call after this meeting ends. If you've ever stood tall when others tried to make you feel small, this story might touch your heart. Follow Heart Stories for more tales of courage, kindness, and the quiet power of living authentically in a world that often misunderstands true success. Harold Banks cleared his throat, drawing attention away from Mason's composed departure back to his seat. Mr. Holloway, we should review the actual documents. I need to verify some final details. What details? Charles asked impatiently. It's simple. Split everything among the grandchildren except Mason. Yes, but there are items in your financial records that require clarification. Harold pulled papers from his portfolio, his expression troubled. I need to understand the source of certain payments. What payments? Charles demanded as the family leaned forward. Your medical expenses over the past 3 years. Harold spread documents across the polished table. Your insurance covers standard care, but the experimental treatments, private nurses, and specialized equipment total approximately $2.4 million. The bills show they were paid in full by an anonymous donor through a medical trust. The room went silent. Charles frowned, confusion spreading across his weathered face. Anonymous donor, I assumed insurance covered everything. No, sir. Insurance covered perhaps 20%. The rest was paid through something called the Holloway Medical Trust. Spencer's face paled. He had been investigating Mason for months, but had missed this crucial detail. His voice strained as he asked, "Who set up this trust?" That's what I needed to clarify today. Harold explained. The trust requires the founders' permission to disclose their identity. I sent a formal request last week. Mason's phone buzzed again with a message from his lawyer. Harold Banks received authorization to disclose medical trust details. Proceed. Mason typed a single word, yes. Harold's phone chimed. He read the message, and his face went completely white. Mrs. Holloway, he addressed Elizabeth, Mason's mother, before turning to Charles. Sir, the Holloway Medical Trust was established by your grandson, Mason. He's been paying all your medical expenses for 3 years. Every bill, every treatment, every piece of equipment, $2.4 million total. The silence was absolute. Charles stared at Mason, his lips trembling. That's impossible, he whispered. Mason doesn't have money. He works at a shelter making poverty wages. He doesn't work at a shelter, sir. Harold continued, reading from his documents. He runs the Holloway Foundation, one of the largest LGBT service nonprofits in the country. According to these records, he founded it 10 years ago after selling a tech startup. The foundation's annual budget is $47 million. Papers scattered as Charles tried to grab them with shaking hands. What startup? Safe Haven, Mason said quietly. I developed an emergency alert app for LGBT people facing violence or homelessness. Sold it to a tech company in 2015 for $32 million. I used most of that money to start the foundation. $32 million, Bradley choked. His smug expression collapsed into shock. The foundation runs 17 centers, Harold continued, employs over 200 people, serves more than 10,000 individuals annually, and has paid every medical bill for Mr. Charles Holloway since his cancer diagnosis 3 years ago. Charles stared at Mason like he'd never seen him before. Veronica looked stunned, her earlier condescension replaced with visible discomfort. You paid for my treatment, Charles asked, his voice barely audible. The experimental immunotherapy that your oncologist recommended, Mason confirmed. Insurance wouldn't cover it. You needed it to survive. But why didn't you tell me? Mason's voice remained gentle. Would you have accepted help from your failure of a grandson, the one wasting his life on charity work? Spencer found his voice. If you have all this money, why do you live in that tiny apartment? Because I don't need much space, Mason replied. And the neighborhood you call terrible is where one of our shelters is located. I live there to be close to the people we serve. The car, Bradley asked weakly, runs perfectly fine. Why replace it? Elizabeth, Mason's mother, was scrolling on her phone, tears streaming down her face. There are articles about you everywhere. Forbes, Fortune, Enbr. Mason Holloway, the silent philanthropist revolutionizing LGBT support services. You won the CNN Heroes Award last year. Why didn't you tell anyone? Charles demanded, a mixture of anger and shame crossing his face. I did tell people, Mason said, the hurt finally showing through his calm exterior. I've mentioned the foundation at every family gathering for 10 years. But anytime I brought it up, someone changed the subject or made a joke about my charity hobby. Eventually, I stopped trying. Harold was still reading through papers. Mr. Holloway, there's more. Mason has been paying for other family expenses as well. Your home renovation last year, the new roof, the accessibility modifications, that was paid through another trust he established. What? Charles's voice was barely audible. I noticed you were having trouble with the stairs. Mason explained. The contractor specialized in aging-in-place modifications, the elevator, wheelchair ramps, bathroom renovations. They were necessary for your safety. How, Mom? Charles whispered. $340,000, Harold answered, paid in full by a trust Mason established specifically for your care. Elizabeth was sobbing openly now. Mason, why didn't you say something? Mason looked at his mother, his expression revealing years of quiet pain. Would it have changed anything? Would it have made you proud of the work I do? Or would you have just been impressed by the money? No one answered. Charles was crying now too, tears streaming down his lined face. I called you a failure. I disinherited you. I told everyone you'd wasted your life. You believed what you wanted to believe, Mason said softly. I tried to explain what I do, but it didn't fit your definition of success. Corporate wham, big salaries, impressive titles. That's what mattered to you. Helping vulnerable people wasn't considered real work. Mason's phone vibrated with another text from his assistant, but he ignored it. The truth was finally being spoken after years of silence, and something inside him needed to let the moment linger. Sometimes the most profound lessons come not from grand speeches or dramatic confrontations, but from simple truths finally acknowledged after being buried beneath years of misunderstanding. Mason, Charles reached out a trembling hand. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply, terribly sorry. Mason took his grandfather's hand, feeling the paper-thin skin and prominent veins beneath his fingers. The room remained silent as grandfather and grandson connected for what felt like the first time in years. Why did you keep paying my bills after how I treated you? Charles asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Because you are my grandfather, Mason answered simply. Because grandmother raised me to believe in taking care of family, and because I could afford it. The money doesn't mean anything if I don't use it to help the people I love. Bradley spoke up, his voice subdued. Mason, I spent 30 minutes at Christmas explaining cryptocurrency to you like you were an idiot. I know, Mason said with a small smile. I was actually invested in 3 crypto funds at the time. I just wanted to hear your perspective. Veronica laughed, but it sounded like a sob. I offered to help you apply for jobs at my firm. I thought you needed career guidance. You were trying to help, Mason acknowledged. I appreciated the thought. Harold cleared his throat. Mr. Holloway, regarding the will, change everything, Charles said immediately. Give it all to Mason. He's the only one who deserves it. No, Mason said firmly. Don't change anything. Split it among everyone as you planned. But you saved my life, Charles protested. You've been supporting me without asking for anything in return. Exactly. Without asking for anything in return. Mason's voice remained steady. I don't want your money, boast, grandfather. I want you to understand that success isn't just about wealth and status. It's about impact, about making people's lives better, about using your resources to help others. But I called you a failure in front of the whole family, Charles said, shame evident in his voice. You were wrong, Mason said simply. But I'm not going to punish you for it. I'm going to do what I've always done, take care of the people I love, whether they appreciate it or not. Spencer, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. Mason, I have to confess something. I've been investigating you for months. Mason turned to his cousin, not surprised. I know. I was jealous, Spencer admitted. You always seemed so free, like you didn't care about the family expectations. I wanted to find something to prove you were a fraud, but all I found was a small apartment, an old car, and volunteer work. I couldn't understand why you seemed content when you had nothing. I have everything that matters, Mason replied. Uncle Richard, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Mason, how can we help the foundation? What do you need? Mason looked at him in surprise. You want to help? We've been idiots, Richard said bluntly. Self-absorbed, materialistic idiots who couldn't see past our own narrow definition of success. You've been doing something extraordinary, and we've been mocking you for it. So yes, how can we help? Mason pulled up the foundation's website on his phone. We always need volunteers, board members, donors, people willing to use their professional skills to support our programs. I'll serve on their board, Veronica said immediately, and my firm can provide pro bono legal services for your clients. Our hedge fund has a charitable giving program, Bradley added. I'll make sure the foundation is a priority. One by one, his cousins offered their support, expertise, connections, and resources. The same people who had applauded his disinheritance 30 minutes ago were now falling over themselves to help. I started Safe Haven after my friend Michael was attacked for being gay, Mason explained, sharing details of his work for the first time with his family. The app lets LGBT people in danger send emergency alerts to trusted contacts with their location. It also connects them with nearby safe houses and resources. Mason described how the app had saved lives, how he'd expanded the foundation to include housing, legal aid, mental health services, and job training. He explained the challenges of fundraising in conservative states and how they developed innovative programs to reach rural LGBT youth. The foundation now operates 17 centers across 6 states. Mason continued, we've helped over 10,000 people find safety, housing, and support. Many of them were rejected by their families, just like I was. Elizabeth's head snapped up. We never rejected you. Mason looked at his mother with gentle eyes. When I came out at 19, grandfather said I was no longer welcome in this house. You didn't defend me. No one did, except grandmother, and she was silenced. I left that Thanksgiving dinner and didn't return for 3 years. The room fell silent as the truth of that painful history settled over them. That's why I created the foundation. Mason continued, I was fortunate. I had my education, my skills, and eventually grandmother's support. Most LGBT kids who get thrown out have nothing. They end up homeless, vulnerable, desperate. I wanted to create the safety net I wished I'd had. Charles was weeping openly now, his frail shoulders shaking. I didn't know. I never thought about where you went that night. I was so angry, so afraid of what people would say. I threw away years with my grandson because of pride. Mason squeezed his grandfather's hand. I forgave you a long time ago, grandfather. That's why I made sure you got the best medical care when you fell ill. Not to earn your approval, but because love doesn't keep score of wrongs. In this moment of revelation, a simple truth emerged. Sometimes those we judge most harshly are fighting battles we cannot see, building legacies we cannot recognize, and demonstrating strengths we've never understood. The true measure of a person lies not in their possessions or titles, but in the lives they touch and the love they give without expectation of return. Charles Holloway, once a pillar of stern authority, now looked diminished in his wheelchair. His weathered hands reached for Mason's with unexpected tenderness. The rest of the family watched in stunned silence as decades of misunderstanding began to dissolve between them. "All these years," Charles whispered, "I thought I knew what success looked like. I thought I was teaching you strength by demanding you follow the Holloway path. Instead, you found more courage than I ever had." Mason smiled gently. "I learned strength from you, grandfather, just not in the way you intended." The Thanksgiving table, usually a battlefield of subtle competition and judgment, had transformed into something more sacred, a place of revelation and perhaps redemption. "I want to understand," Charles said. "Tell me about these centers you've built." Mason described how the Holloway Foundation had grown from a single shelter in Boston to 17 facilities across New England and the Mid-Atlantic. He explained how they'd provided emergency housing, medical care, legal assistance, and job training for LGBT youth who had been rejected by their families. "Many of them arrived with nothing but the clothes they're wearing," Mason said, "just like I did that night I left here. The difference is, I had my education and eventually found support. Most of these kids have nowhere to go and no one to help them." Bradley, who had spent years viewing his cousin through a lens of superiority, looked genuinely shaken. "How many people have you owed?" "Last year, we provided services to over 10,000 individuals," Mason answered. "But the need is much greater. For every person we help, there are 5 more we can't reach yet." Spencer, who had been suspiciously quiet, finally spoke. "I found your apartment during my investigation. I went there, thinking I would find some scandal. Instead, I saw you bringing groceries to an elderly couple upstairs. I watched you help a teenage boy with homework on your front steps. I couldn't understand why someone would choose to live that way when they had options. Because that neighborhood is where I'm needed," Mason said simply. "Those teenagers at the center become my family. Their struggles and triumphs matter to me." Veronica looked thoughtful. "Our firm has a diversity initiative that's mostly for show. What if we created a real legal clinic at your centers? We could help with name changes, discrimination cases, asylum applications." "That would be incredible," Mason replied, his eyes lighting up. "Legal services are among our most requested and least available resources." One by one, family members began offering their skills and connections. David, the doctor, proposed a free health clinic. Bradley talked about financial literacy workshops. Elizabeth, Mason's mother, sat quietly, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed her son's impact. "I'll establish a scholarship fund," Charles announced suddenly. "The Mason Holloway Scholarship for LGBT youth, $5 million to start." He looked around the table. "Who will match me?" Hands went up around the table. Even Spencer raised his, though he looked less certain than the others. "I've been cruel to you," Spencer admitted to Mason. "I've been trying to undermine you for years because I thought you were the weak link in the family. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Mason nodded, accepting the apology without dwelling on the past hurt. "There's room for everyone to contribute. Spencer, your business skills could help our job placement program." Harold Banks, who had been observing with quiet amazement, spoke up. "Mr. Holloway, would you like me to schedule another meeting to revise the will?" Charles looked at Mason. "What do you want, Mason?" "I want you to get better," Mason answered. "I want you to have more years with your family. I want you to understand that your grandson who works at a shelter is doing work that matters, even if it doesn't come with a corner office and a 6-figure salary." 7-figure, Elizabeth corrected unexpectedly. Everyone turned to look at her. Mason's salary from the foundation is public record for nonprofits over a certain size. He makes $180,000 a year, plus the wealth from his startup exit. He's probably worth more than everyone in this room combined. "Net worth isn't the same as self-worth," Mason said gently. "I learned that from grandfather. He taught me that what you do with your life matters more than what you accumulate." I just applied that lesson differently than he expected. Charles pulled Mason down into a hug, his frail arms surprisingly strong. "I'm proud of you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have said it years ago. I'm so incredibly proud of you." which Mason held his grandfather, feeling the years of longing for those words dissolve in the warmth of their embrace. Around them, the family watched with a mixture of shame and new understanding. "I'd like to propose something," Charles said, addressing the entire family. "Next week, we all visit one of Mason's centers together. I want to see this work firsthand, and I want us all to learn how we can truly help." Nods of agreement circled the table. David stood up. "And I'd like to propose that Mason rejoin the Family Foundation board, not as a junior member, but as co-chair. His experience in nonprofit management clearly exceeds all of ours." Charles nodded firmly. Seconded and approved. As the formal meeting portion concluded, family members approached Mason one by one. Some offered tearful apologies. Others asked thoughtful questions about the foundation's work. His mother held him in a long, silent embrace that said more than words could convey. The Thanksgiving dinner that had begun as Mason's public humiliation had transformed into something no one could have predicted, a homecoming of sorts, not just for Mason, but for the values of compassion and service that had been overshadowed by the pursuit of wealth and status. In witnessing Mason's quiet integrity, the Holloway family was discovering that a true legacy isn't built on money or power, but on the courage to live by one's deepest values, even when those values challenge the expectations of those we love most. As Mason drove back to his modest apartment in his 15-year-old Honda, evening had settled over Cape Cod. Lights glimmered in distant windows. Families gathered around tables sharing meals and memories, unaware that the Holloway dynasty had just experienced an earthquake of revelation. His phone rang as he pulled into his parking spot. Charles's number. "Mason, it's me." His grandfather's voice sounded different, softer, without the commanding edge that had defined it for decades. "Hi, grandfather. The estate lawyer said you've been paying for everything, not just medical bills. You've been covering the home care nurses, the meal service, the transportation to appointments, everything. I wanted you to be comfortable," Mason said simply. "Why?" The question hung in the air, heavy with decades of rejection. "After how I treated you, because you're my grandfather, because grandmother loved you, because she taught me that family takes care of each other. You just forgot that lesson applied to me, too." Charles was quiet for a moment. "Will you come visit me tomorrow? Not for a family meeting, just you and me. I want to see everything, the foundation, the shelters, the programs. I want to understand what you've built." "I'd like that," Mason replied softly. "Mason," Charles's voice cracked, "thank you for saving my life. For loving me when I didn't deserve it. For being a better person than I ever taught you to be. You taught me more than you know," Mason said. "Good and bad, I just learned to keep the good parts and leave the rest." After they hung up, Mason sat in his car for a while, watching the lights come on in apartments around him. His building wasn't fancy, but it was home. More importantly, it was 2 blocks from the shelter where he'd spent the morning helping a young man find emergency housing after being thrown out by religious parents. 6 months later, Charles Holloway sat in his wheelchair at the annual Pride Parade in Boston. He wore a t-shirt that read, "Proud of my grandson," in rainbow letters. Behind him stood Elizabeth, Bradley, Veronica, and even Spencer, all wearing Holloway Foundation volunteer shirts. They cheered as Mason addressed the crowd from a small stage. "Today we're announcing the Mason Holloway Scholarship Fund." Mason told the gathered crowd, $5 million in initial funding to help LGBT youth pursue education after experiencing family rejection. What the crowd didn't know was that the initial funding had come from Charles himself, matched by contributions from every adult member of the Holloway family. The scholarship had been Charles's idea, his way of creating a legacy that honored rather than erased his grandson's identity. The Holloway Foundation had expanded too, adding 3 new centers in rural areas where resources were scarce. Veronica now led their legal aid program. Bradley had developed a financial literacy curriculum, and David supervised free health clinics at each location. Even Spencer had found his place, using his business connections to create job placement opportunities. As Mason looked out at the crowd from the stage, he saw not just his biological family, but his chosen one. Hundreds of young people from the Foundation's programs, wearing t-shirts with the Foundation logo. Many had been homeless, hopeless, rejected by those who should have loved them unconditionally. Now they stood tall, finding in community what biology had denied them. Charles reached for Mason's hand as he rejoined his family after the speech. "I wasted so many years," the older man said, his eyes moist. "I thought I was teaching you about legacy, but you're the one who showed me what it really means." Mason squeezed his grandfather's hand. It's never too late to learn new lessons. That evening, they gathered for a different kind of family dinner at Mason's still modest apartment. The conversation flowed naturally around work at the Foundation, stories of lives changed, and plans for expansion. The wealth and status that had once dominated every Holloway gathering were barely mentioned. Instead, they spoke of impact, purpose, and service, the values that Mason had quietly lived while his family had dismissed them. Success, Mason had learned, wasn't about impressing your family with corner offices or trust funds. Success was knowing that somewhere tonight, a young person was sleeping in a safe bed because of work he'd done, a family was healing because of programs he'd funded, a life was rebuilding because of the community he'd helped create. That was worth more than any inheritance, so that was worth everything. Have you ever misjudged someone only to discover they were extraordinary in ways you couldn't see? Or perhaps you've been the one misjudged, silently creating impact while others underestimated your worth. Sometimes our greatest contributions happen in spaces others don't value. And our truest strength shows in how we love those who may not deserve it. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Heart Stories for more powerful narratives about love, forgiveness, and the courage to live authentically even when the world or your family misunderstands your path.